this is the Longines HydroConquest 39mm in all black. Feels like this is one of the most talked about watch releases of 2026. And I've had it for a couple of months and I'm very excited to finally review it and see if it lives up to the hype. Also, I should say that this is a very new channel on YouTube. And I've been very impressed by all the positive comments and the number of subscribers within just a month of starting. So thank you to all you early supporters. I really, really appreciate it. But now I've got a lot of things to say about this watch, so without further ado, let's dive right in. So why did I get the HydroConquest 39mm? Well, to begin with, I'm a big fan of divers. Not because I go diving, I mean, I can barely swim, but because I think the timing bezel on a dive watch is one of the most useful complications you can get. I've had dive watches from a number of brands actually, including Seiko, which I've reviewed, Squally, Miso, Certina, which I have right here, and now Longines. Before I got this, I had the GMT version of the HydroConquest that they released a couple of years earlier. Now, I absolutely love that watch. However, I always thought that was a little too big because it was 41 meters. Well, 41 meters would be very big because it was 41 millimeters, which I thought was a little too big for my 17 centimeter wrist. So when Longines released the 39mm HydroConquest, I really thought I should check that out. Of course, when I replaced the GMT with this, I lost the GMT function, but it ended up working out anyway because I got the Casio MRG in the meantime, and that has a world time function. Now the HydroConquest comes in a number of different colorways, including the all black, like this one, the all blue, the all green, the black and blue, the gray and black, and I think there's also a new silk edition. So there's a lot of options. And they come with either the H-link bracelets, like on this one, or a Milanese, like a mesh bracelet. And I went for the all black one because I thought that was going to be a lot more versatile. And of course, I already have a blue diver in the Certina DS Action. So I thought this would be the best choice for me. But to truly appreciate what Longines is, we have to look at the history. Now, Longines was founded in 1832 in a little town called Saint-Imier in Switzerland. Now, of course, the Longines name came a little after in 1867. So that still represents about over 190 years of continuous production of watches, which I think is quite formidable to begin with. So, of course, the Longines name and the winged hourglass logo are considered the oldest trademark still in use in watchmaking. These trademarks were registered in 1889, and they were the 14th ever registered ever in the history of the World Intellectual Property Organization. But interestingly, the 13 that came before it no longer exist. So that's a first that I think is worth celebrating. Of course, that's not the only first when it comes to Longines. They had a number of technical firsts as well. So they were the first to measure 1/5 of a second in 1889. They were the first brand to produce a wrist chronograph in 1913, the first wristwatch with a rotating bezel like this one in 1931. They also had the first patent for the flyback chronograph in 1936. So what's interesting is that all of this happened before the Rolex Submariner even existed. That was in the 50s. So I think that's very, very impressive for a brand that is not as well known as Omega or Rolex. Now, I mentioned earlier that the other thing that drew me to Longines was their connection to aviation. But what is this connection? Now, actually, this is very impressive. I think this is one of the reasons that I love this brand. So Charles Lindbergh in 1927 completed the first solo non-stop flight from New York to Paris, so across the Atlantic. And so when he arrives in the Bourget airport in Paris, that was organized by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, and that flight was timed by none other than Longines. But the connection doesn't stop there. You see, Lindbergh had some trouble navigating during that first flight. So he worked with Longines to create the hour angle watch, which was an actual aerial navigation instrument. And that was first released in 1931 and is still produced today. And if that's not enough, Amelia Earhart also wore a Longines chronograph on both the Atlantic crossings in 1928 and 1932. So this connection to aviation is not just marketing. It's real history, and I think it deserves recognition. Now, of course, this watch doesn't have anything to do with aviation. It's part of a different line. So Longines has a couple of different product lines. So Conquest is a dressier, more elegant line, and the first model was released in 1954, around the same time Rolex released the Explorer. The HydroConquest, the line of diver watches, was released much later in 2007. Now, I think the early models were a bit busier, a bit clunkier, but that forged the way to this model that we have today. So this model is the 2026 version of the HydroConquest. And like I said, this doesn't come out of the void. It's very much based on the GMT version that was released in 2023. So what's new in this version, right? The first thing you'll notice compared to the previous HydroConquest, the non-GMT version, is the dial layout. So you don't have the signature numerals on the 12, the 9, and the 6. So that's been replaced with a much cleaner look with just shapes, right? So it's triangles, batons, and circles. And this dial is actually a callback to their Admiral dial from the 1990s. So I think that it's wonderful that Longines went back to their catalog to take some inspiration. What's new is also this case layout that some have claims is a little too reminiscent of the Submariner. We'll go into that in a bit, but certainly there is some truth to that. And I think that's partially because the actual crown guards are not as pointy as they were in the past, and so that's probably one of the reasons that it's more reminiscent of the Submariner. What's really new in this version that the GMT did not have is a significantly improved bezel action. I mean, that is just heavenly. So I think that is the biggest upgrade in 2026. But now let's go into the details of this watch. So the case is obviously in stainless steel, and it does have that classic Submariner-like look, which is true. Now, I've put an image here of the Submariner so you can compare, but you do see similarities. And like I said, the crown guard plays its part in that. But to be fair to Longines, most modern dive watches somehow take inspiration from the Submariner. It's the prototypical blueprint of a dive watch. So I don't think we can give Longines too much flack for that. I also like the 39mm diameter because I think that's the perfect size for a modern sporty dive watch. I actually think the 41 of the GMT was a little too big. Now this also has the standard 20mm lug width. So for those of you who have a huge collection of 20mm straps, oh well, you're in luck. And especially if you get this black model, I think it'll go with so many different styles. But perhaps the most striking feature of this case is that for a watch with 300 meters of water resistance, it's extremely thin. It's actually 11.7mm thick or thin. Now what I also like is this all brushed finish. Because, I mean, obviously a diver is more a tool watch than it is a dress watch, right? So it's fitting that it should have this brushed look, and it's really brushed all over. But it does have touches of polishing. For example, on the edge of the bezel here, and also on the actual crown. There's some polishing on the edges of the bracelets as well, on the links. So it does have that mix, but it's mostly brushing, which I think is very appropriate for this style. Obviously, it has a screw-down case back for that 300 meters of water resistance, and maybe you can tell, if you look carefully, there's the Wings Hourglass logo there. Perhaps you don't see it very well, but it is there, and that's very nice as well. I mean, I would have liked for the case back to be a display case, but that's very uncommon for dive watches. The other thing that's worth noting is this crown. Now, I think it's a really, really nice size. It's very easy to get hold of, but more than that, the actual experience of winding it is buttery smooth. The first time I tried to do that, I wondered if it was even working at all because it is that smooth. Finally, this watch size for my 17 centimeter wrist weighs only 150 grams, which I think is excellent. Now, the other reason I think this watch is captivating, especially this version, is that lacquer black dial. I mean, look at it. It's got this lovely depth to it. And I think lacquer dials really have that sense of luxury somehow. Surely also because they're quite glittery. They do reflect a fair bit. But that's not really a problem when you have a black and white watch, because the contrast is sufficient that you can still read the time very well. But you do have that almost endless depth, which is of course accentuated also by these applied indices. And one of the reasons you can see the indices so well in all angles is that the sapphire crystal actually has anti-reflective coating on both sides, on the inside and the outside. So there's very little reflection. Now, some people don't like that because, of course, the anti-reflective coating can get scratched, but I do think it does elevate the legibility of the watch. So, of course, this dial has been the subject of much controversy. I mean, I say controversy, a lot of talk on the internet, right? Because the two main criticisms: one, it's boring compared to the previous version. It's lost some of its DNA, and certainly that's an argument that could be made. I much prefer the cleaner dial of the 2026 version than the previous ones, but I can see the arguments. The other criticism is that the dial has too many shapes. Now, I don't really get this, to be honest, because if I compare it with the Certina, right, I think it's pretty much the same number of shapes. So you've got the triangle at the 12, you've got the date window, so the rectangular date window at the 3 o'clock position. On the Certina, you have round indices for like the 1 and 2. On the Longines, you have batons. And on the Certina, you have baton-like indices at the 9 and 6. And on this one, you have the round ones. So in many ways, it's a bit of an inverted classic dive watch look, an inverted Submariner look, if you like. So that doesn't bother me at all. Some people also complain that the dial is asymmetrical, but I think that asymmetry is more interesting generally than forced symmetry. So I love the date window. I think it's a very useful complication. So for me, the dial is balanced, it's clean, and it's modern. I wouldn't change a thing about this dial. I really, really like it. Now, the lume on this watch is quite good. I would even say it's excellent. I hesitate to say it's excellent because once you have a Seiko watch in your collection and you've seen what a Lume Bright is like, nothing will compare, right? But it is visible in all conditions throughout the night. I have worn this to bed, and no matter at what time I wake up, at 5 or 6 or even 7 in the morning, I've always been able to tell the time. And the other nice thing about the lume on this watch is that it's a nice mix of green for the indices and the hour hands, and the minutes hand has this blue hue. So it's a bit like this Omega-like dual color lume, which I think is very, very nice. So now let's talk about the bracelets. Now, the bracelet on this watch also, I think, is the other reason it's such great value. Because to begin with, the H-Link bracelet is very comfortable. Keep in mind that some models come with a mesh bracelets, but I opted for the H-Link. Now, I'm going to take off my my MRG here, which also has a really nice bracelet. But then again, that is to be expected for a watch that costs twice as much as this one. So I'm going to take this off and put the Longines on. And you can tell that it just fits so well. So it sits on the wrist very, very flat, very comfortably. The lugs aren't too long, and the H-Link articulates perfectly. Now, perhaps on a hot day like we've been having here in Europe, sometimes you'll find that your wrist expands a little too much. Now, with the MRG, I can't fix that without a tool, right? But luckily it's made of titanium and it's quite light, so I wear it quite loose anyway. But for a stainless steel watch, what would be really nice is some way to loosen it up a little bit. And luckily, Longines gives you just that option, because this one has on-the-fly adjust. So what you do is I just open this up and I press a little tab here, a little button, and I can size the bracelets up and down a few millimeters, right? So on a really hot day, I can just go all the way out, put it on, and suddenly it's a lot more comfortable than it was 2 seconds ago. So that's a very, very useful bit of feature. As far as the bracelet is concerned, this is one of the best ones you can get at this price point. Right, now the movements. I don't think most people would consider Longines movements to be in-house, but they are made by ETA exclusively for Longines. ETA is owned by the Swatch Group, as is Longines, and so they benefit from that as well. So the movement is the L888.5, and that is based on the ETA A31, which is itself derived from the classic, reliable ETA 2892. And in fact, it is assembled at Saint-Imier by Longines, right? So in some ways, you could consider it in-house. And it also has some quirks that I quite like, actually. So unlike the standard ETA 2892, the Longines version does not run at the usual 4 Hz. It runs at a reduced 3.5 Hz. So instead of 28,800, which is what the 2892 has, this one beats at 25,200 vibrations per hour. You can't really tell. I've tried to compare this with the 4 Hz movements. You can't really tell, but it's just a little quirky detail that I quite like. And the reason they did that is to be able to extend that power reserve all the way up to 72 hours, which this has. Now, of course, if you were to go with a Powermatic watch, which a lot of other brands within the Swatch Group like Mido or Certina offer, you'd get 80 hours of power reserve, but you'd have to go down to 3 Hz for that. The 3 Hz never bothered me, but I do like the quirkiness of the 3.5 Hz. And as far as the movement go, of course, something that's quite important to me is the accuracy. And with this one, accuracy is just not a problem. In fact, this is well within COSC specs without paying the price of COSC certification. Now, Longines, of course, has watches like the Spirit Zulu that are COSC certified. This one is not, but I've been getting plus minus 1 second a day, which is absolutely exceptional. So right, now what are some of the pros and cons? Of course, I think the biggest pro for the HydroConquest is that it gets the most important things just right. So the size, the dial design that is very versatile, the finishing, which is excellent for this price point, the ceramic bezel, the thinness, the 300 meters of water resistance, and most of all, and really I cannot stress this enough, the bezel action. I mean, it's just absolutely excellent, and it's very satisfying to use, which I think is a huge part of enjoying a dive watch, really. The other pro is, of course, the price. For about 2,000 euros, you're getting something that genuinely competes with watches costing significantly more, like the Omega Planet Ocean or the TAG Aqua Racer. And I think that this watch actually fares even better, in my humble opinion, than the Omega Planet Ocean. It looks nicer. So this watch in general feels a lot more premium than the price suggests. So when you buy a watch, it's not just the watch you should consider, it's a long-term commitment. And servicing is part of that. What I like is that the Swatch Group companies publish their servicing costs on their website, which I find to be quite transparent, and the prices are generally quite reasonable as well. So that's something that I think is quite good. And also, this one comes with a 5-year warranty. The Certina, I think, came with a 2-year warranty, or maybe it was 3 years, and I think that's really something to be considered as well. I will talk about the warranty in a bit, by the way, because I have sent this in for warranty repair, and so that experience is very interesting as well. And finally, the last pro is that if you're getting especially the black version, it is particularly versatile. It really goes with everything, and this could, as is often the case with the watches I review on this channel, be your only watch, the one and done. As good as this watch is, of course, it has some minor cons. I think the hour hand is somehow out of place. And the reason is that, unlike with the Certina, right, you can tell, even at a glance, that the hour hand is an hour hand, perhaps because the Lume is very distinct. On the Longines, the Lume is limited to the little diamond shape, so I think that affects the legibility just a tad bit. And I think that would be better if it was sort of a sword hand or a syringe hand. I think that would have made the legibility slightly better. Also, I've noticed that the date change at midnight is not instant. It takes a couple of minutes. On the Certina, the date changes instantly at around midnight. Again, the difference is very minor, it's just a couple of more minutes, but it's worth noting. Like I mentioned earlier, another con might be that it has anti-reflective coating on both sides, so that takes away the scratch resistance of the sapphire crystal. I would have liked for there to be a see-through case back, but of course, like I mentioned, this is completely normal for a dive watch. And finally, the resale value of a watch like this will never match something like that of an Omega or a Rolex. So, but again, that's completely expected at this price point. Once you buy this and you walk out the store, its value decreases significantly. I had a problem with the watch about a month later. So essentially, I noticed that there was a small speck of dust on the inside of the dial. It wasn't really a big problem, but I thought I'd take it in anyway. When the store very kindly took the watch in and sent it to Longines for servicing. And in fact, they for some reason, they also changed the case back and gave me a new warranty card, because then that triggers a new serial number. The whole process took about a month and a half and was overall very nice. Now, interestingly, the GMT that I had before this also had a bit of an issue a month after purchase. I noticed the seconds hand stop randomly for a few minutes whilst I was using it, and I could go on the Swatch website and order a kit that I could use to put my watch in and mail it to the service center in Pforzheim. They had a look at it, I confirmed that something was wrong, and they replaced some of the parts and sent it back to me in a month and a half again, and that was of course naturally all free. So again, the servicing experience was very positive. So when you're buying a watch, do keep in mind that you're also buying the after sales support, and in my experience, Longines has been excellent with that. Of course, you could argue that those things shouldn't have happened at all, and perhaps there was a problem with quality control. That is certainly possible, but in any case, the problem was resolved very quickly and at their expense, so I can't really complain too much. So, who is this for, and what are the alternatives? So I think the HydroConquest is for anyone who's looking for a solid diver that gets almost everything right, with just that touch of luxury, but without the luxury prices. This can genuinely be your only watch, especially if you get the black one. For the quality, the finishing, the brand heritage, that bezel action, again, absolutely amazing. Also the accuracy of the movements, all of that is a very solid package for the price, because sometimes you pay a lot more for a watch that does not deliver this much value. Now, if you were to look for a cheaper alternative, I would recommend something like the Certina DS Action. I absolutely love this watch, and it costs half the price of the Longines HydroConquest. Also, if you have small wrists, this comes in at 38 millimeters. You could consider Mido, another Swatch Group brand. They have the Ocean Star line that I find is absolutely excellent. You could go for Seiko with their Prospex line, or Squale, that has contributed so much to dive watch history, or of course Doxa. And if you want to go for some more expensive alternatives and you want to move up in that hierarchy, I would consider the Tudor Pelagos 39. I absolutely love that watch. I think design is pretty much perfect. Of course, you've got the Omega Seamaster Pro 300, or indeed the Planet Ocean, although I think this is better value than the Planet Ocean. And of course, the Tag Heuer Aqua Racer. That's excellent as well. So in conclusion, I think that the HydroConquest 39 is one of the best value propositions in the diver space right now. You just can't beat it. And I would say that the hype is real. It's merited, it's warranted, it's just that good. Of course, I will also be doing a comparison between the Longines HydroConquest 39 and the Certina DS Action 38. So if you're interested in that, do subscribe and you'll be notified. I hope you've enjoyed this review. And if you have the HydroConquest, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye.